She stepped into the courthouse boots, muddy heart burning. "You forged my father's deed," she said right to the judge's face. No one backed her, except Caleb Boone, a quiet cowboy with a surveyor's kit and a stubborn streak. That one truth cost them everything. Her barn burned, his ribs broke, and still they stood side by side. In a town where justice wore badges but served the rich, could a torn ledger and a rusted seal bring the truth to light? Watch what happens when the past won't stay buried, and one cowboy takes every blow just to help her speak. The rain had let up just enough to leave streaks of mud down the front steps of the Dusty Creek courthouse, but Eliza Carter didn't slow her stride. Her boots slapped against the stone, her coat flared behind her like a flag someone dared to plant. She was soaked to the knees and gripping a folded ledger tight to her chest. Inside, the crowd gathered for the weekly land auction was already buzzing. Farmers, ranchers, men in wide hats and clean boots. They weren't used to women stomping in like thunder, but that's exactly what she did. Eliza scanned the room, then raised her voice above the chatter. "Judge Hollis," she called loud and clear, "you forged those deeds. You're stealing my father's land." Gasps rippled. The room hushed like air being sucked from a bottle. All heads turned to the raised platform, where Judge Elias Hollis, thick around the middle and heavy in reputation, sat smug in his chair. Sheriff Merrick shifted uneasily beside him, hand resting near his holster, not drawing, not yet, just letting everyone know it was there. The judge didn't blink. "Miss Carter, I'd advise you to lower your tone before you embarrass yourself." "You already did that," Eliza shot back. "When you filed a claim under a name that's been dead 5 years. Whispers erupted. A few men backed toward the door, not wanting to get pulled into anything legal or loud. Hollis sneered. "You're a grieving daughter, nothing more. That land reverted back to the bank when your father failed to recertify. My father paid those taxes. I've got the records in this ledger. Anyone can draw numbers on paper, but not forge a seal, not fake his signature." She took a step forward, raising the ledger. "You stole from a man buried in Dusty Creek soil, and you think no one's gonna say a word." The sheriff stepped in. "That's enough. You're disrupting a legal proceeding. I'm disrupting a lie." No one moved to stop her, but no one moved to stand with her either, except one man. He'd been leaning against the far wall, boots muddy, a canvas surveyor's bag at his feet. Caleb Boone. Folks didn't know much about him, except he was quiet, showed up when help was needed, and never played cards with the men who wore tin stars. Caleb pushed off the wall, picked up his kit, and followed Eliza out as the judge called for recess. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was bruised and low. She didn't look at him until they reached the footbridge, past the general store. "Why'd you come?" she asked. Caleb shrugged. "You were right. Not many folks get that far." She exhaled, half a laugh, half a sigh. "Doesn't feel like it. You carrying forged papers?" "No." He nodded once. Then truth still got a leg under it. They walked in silence for a while, boots squelching in the wet clay. "You don't talk much," Eliza said, glancing sideways. "Nope. You afraid of being seen with me?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Truth don't get quieter just 'cause people don't want to hear it." She looked at him, then really looked. Mud on his coat, hair damp and flat, but his eyes clear, solid. Back at the courthouse, the judge sat behind closed doors, whispering with the sheriff, plans already shifting. And in the field just outside of town, wind moved through the grass on her father's land. Someone powerful had decided was worth lying for. Eliza Carter had stirred something dangerous. But Caleb Boone had followed, and that was how every storm started, with one voice and one pair of boots refusing to turn back. And by the time morning came, Dusty Creek would remember who first dared to speak. By the time the sun rose over Dusty Creek, the town square held a fresh notice nailed straight to the board beneath the post office awning: "Warrant for forgery Eliza Carter, to be held for fraudulent land claims." Her name was printed large black ink bleeding slightly from the early morning dew. Beneath it, Sheriff Merrick's signature curled like a snake in dust. Eliza stood before it, eyes scanning every line. Around her, folks passed by a little quicker than usual. A couple whispered. One old man tugged his hat brim low and looked away entirely. She didn't blink, just swallowed once, then walked off slow. By mid-morning, the Carter barn was a wall of flame. Eliza and Caleb were already out back working to reset fence lines when they heard the pop of dry timber and the roar that followed. She dropped her tool and sprinted. He was right behind her. They filled buckets from the creek and ran them up the hill until their arms shook. The blaze leapt anyway. Sparks danced like devils in the air. It took until dawn to put the fire out. The barn was nothing but ribs of charred wood and smoke curling off the ground. Eliza stood barefoot in the ash face streaked with soot. Her voice was hoarse from yelling. They didn't even try to hide it. Caleb crouched beside a pile of collapsed boards. Something glinted between them. He reached in and pulled out a corner of parchment singed but legible. "County form," he muttered. "Filed this year. But the barn's been locked up since spring. This didn't come from your papers." Eliza stepped closer. "What does that mean?" He handed it over. "Means someone planted it. Made sure there would be proof when the sheriff comes sniffing." She stared at it, official, stamp-fresh signature. "They're building a case," she whispered. Caleb didn't reply. He didn't need to. She could feel it in her gut the same way a horse senses a storm long before the thunder rolls. By mid-afternoon, Caleb rode out alone, said he had a stop to make. He headed north up into the hills past the old mill, where Notary Thomas lived, in a cabin shaded by two enormous pines. Folks said he'd gone half-blind, but kept records like his mind was a steel trap. The man had notarized half the land deals in southern Arizona. When Caleb arrived, the old man was sitting on the porch with a wool blanket around his knees and a tin of tobacco on the rail. "Thomas," Caleb said, tying off his reins. The man blinked. "Boone ain't seen you since that fence dispute down near Bisbee." Caleb nodded. "Need your eyes on a form." He handed over the singed paper. Thomas adjusted his spectacles and squinted. Recognize this." He tapped the signature. "Saw Judge Hollis stamped near a dozen just like this one last spring." "You sure?" Thomas looked up slow and steady. "He said it was for bank processing. Claimed backlog. Never did like the smell of it." Caleb's jaw tensed. "You have any copies?" Thomas shook his head. "Nope. He took every last one with him. Said they were confidential." That night, Caleb slept in the barn at Eliza's place, what was left of it anyway. She offered the porch. He said he had rather stay close in case more trouble came. But come morning, the trouble had already arrived. Thomas's cabin was gone. Reduced to embers, the old pines stood scorched, blackened to the root. Caleb sat in the saddle, hands tight on the reins, staring at the smoke still curling skyward. The message wasn't subtle. They were getting close. Too close. And whoever was pulling strings in Dusty Creek had no intention of letting truth get loose. But the flames that meant to scare them off only lit the path they needed to take next. The morning after Thomas's cabin burned, the sky over Dusty Creek was thick with gray, not smoke, not fog, just the kind of cloud cover that felt like warning. Eliza Carter sat at her father's desk, hands buried in papers that still smelled faintly of cedar and cattle feed. The fire hadn't reached the house, but the fear it brought in its wake had crept through the walls. She opened drawer after drawer, pulling out tax slips, feed bills, old seed orders. Nothing that proved ownership, nothing the law would take seriously. Until she found the bag. It was tucked behind a warped floorboard under her father's bed. A battered field satchel, the kind he used to take out when walking fence lines. Inside the canvas was stiff with age. And at the bottom, beneath two rusted tools and a folded map, was a thick, weather-stained ledger. She placed it on the kitchen table, fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. "Caleb," she called. He was in the back room patching up a broken shutter. "You all right?" She didn't answer right away. When he stepped into the doorway, she held up the book. Found it. He crossed the room in 2 strides. The handwriting was unmistakably John Carter's tight, angular script that cataloged each spring planting, every grazing head rainfall, and tax paid. Caleb flipped to the front. There it was. Land grant, March 12, 1878. Signed and sealed by the county clerk. "Accept the seal. It's nearly rubbed off," he said, squinting. "Think they'll accept it?" He exhaled slowly. "Depends who's asking, and who's listening." "I don't want to ask here," she said. "Not after what happened to Thomas." Caleb nodded. "Then we ride." They left before noon, heading south toward Bisbee Territorial Seat, where records still mattered more than rumors. The road was long and pocked with old ruts, the kind that jarred your bones and made silence stretch longer than it should. Halfway there, Caleb finally spoke. "Your father ever talk about that land deed?" Eliza glanced sideways, only that he paid it twice. Once in coin, once in sweat. He nodded. "Sounds about right." When they reached the office in Bisbee, it took an hour of back and forth with a clerk named Maggie before she disappeared into the archives. Another hour later, she returned with a leather-bound registry. This is the county's original record from '78, she said, laying it flat. Let's see. She flipped through pages marked in careful ink. When she reached the right week, March 12th, her brow furrowed. There's a gap here. Entry numbers jump from 4/18 to 4/22. That's 3 deeds missing. Caleb leaned in. You sure it's not misfiled? No. These entries were manually written. No room for mistakes. If it's not here, it's because it was removed. Eliza's voice came low. Erased? Maggie gave a slow nod. Someone didn't just file a new deed. They scrubbed the old one right out of history. Caleb looked down at the ledger in his hands. The faded seal, the planting records, the tax lines. All still intact, but without the original on file, they'd be dismissed as personal notes. Unless, he turned to Maggie, that seal, can we match it to the originals from that year? She opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed stamp sheet used by the county in the 1870s. Only 2 still exist. They compared them side by side, the shape, the pressure, the faint break in the outer ring identical. Eliza felt something shift in her chest, like ground finally giving way to roots that had been trying to push through all along. It's not just ours, Caleb said. It was stolen, and whoever did it had help. Maggie nodded solemnly. You'll want to be careful, miss. This goes beyond land. As they saddled up to head back, Eliza looked to the horizon. They buried our claim, she said, but they forgot to burn the roots. And this time, she wasn't coming back empty-handed. Because if someone could erase the past, she'd just make sure the truth screamed louder than silence ever could. Dusty Creek's annual harvest picnic was the kind of event that made folks forget for a few hours how dry the land had been, or how deep the bank's hooks reached. The churchyard was full by noon, checkered blankets laid out, pies lined up on folding tables, and kids racing between hay bales, while grown-ups swapped small-town gossip beneath paper fans and wide-brimmed hats. Eliza Carter stood near the pie table, her father's ledger tucked beneath her arm like a Bible. Her dress was plain, her boots still dusted from the ride back from Bisbee, but her chin was lifted higher than it had in weeks. You sure about this? Caleb asked from her side, wiping dust from his hands. I'm not hiding it anymore. She gently placed the ledger next to a dish of peach cobbler, where everyone could see the bold label in her handwriting, John Carter, Land Records, 1878 to 1888. Caleb gave a small nod, then stepped aside as folks wandered closer, squinting at the label, whispering behind their palms. Eliza came a soft voice behind her. It was Miss Downey, the new schoolteacher barely in town 6 months, with her pale gloves and careful words. Eliza hadn't spoken more than pleasantries to her until now. You used to clerk for Judge Hollis, didn't you? Eliza asked. Miss Downey hesitated, eyes darting toward the picnic tables, then back to Eliza. I did. Briefly, before the school board offered me this post. Caleb stepped up, his tone even. We found gaps in the registry, whole entries missing. Miss Downey looked down at her gloved hands, then leaned in voice, barely above a whisper. He had me burn half a file drawer. Old land claims. Said they were duplicates, but they weren't. I knew it wasn't right. Eliza's breath caught. I'm sorry, Miss Downey added, already stepping away. But I have a son. Please understand. Eliza's eyes stayed on her retreating form for a moment. Then she turned back to the table. She picked up the ledger, opened it to the deed page, and pinned it open with a jar of apple jelly. Let them see. Let them all see. Judge Hollis arrived not long after arriving in a tidy buggy, with Sheriff Merrick by his side. The judge wore his best waistcoat, a gold watch chain glinting like pride in the sun. He greeted townsfolk with fake warmth, patting shoulders and shaking hands. Until he saw the ledger. His face turned a slow, dangerous red. What's that? He barked, striding toward the table. Eliza didn't flinch. A record. My father's land. Tax logs. Witnessed seal. You're a fraud, he snarled. That ledger is fabricated. Then let the town see and judge for themselves, she said, gesturing wide. But Judge Hollis was already turning to the sheriff. Arrest her, he snapped. Forgery and public disruption. The crowd murmured. Some stepped back. Others looked away. Caleb moved between Eliza and the sheriff. She's not leaving in chains. Not here. Not today. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. Step aside, Boone. I'm standing right where I ought to be. A deputy flanked Caleb, fast swinging before the cowboy could finish his breath. The blow caught him in the gut, knocking him sideways. His hat hit the dirt, kicked aside like a kicked truth. Gasps rose. Eliza moved to help, but 2 other deputies closed in. You keep your hands where we can see 'em, Miss Carter. Caleb coughed, hand clutching his ribs. He met Eliza's eyes and gave the faintest shake of his head. Don't make it worse. The picnic broke up fast after that. Plates left half full. Laughter turned sour. The ledger disappeared into the sheriff's saddlebag. Eliza stood alone beside the empty pie table watching as the law rode away with her truth and her only ally bent over in pain. But just before the crowd vanished completely, a small hand tugged at Caleb's coat where he sat on the edge of the grass. It was Miss Downey's boy, dirt-smudged and serious. He pressed a folded slip of paper into Caleb's palm and whispered, "Mama said don't read it here. Wait till dark." Then the boy was gone. And in Caleb's bruised grip, a path forward flickered again. Sometimes, even in a silence, that loud a whisper found its way through. The knock on Eliza's door came just after sunup. Caleb leaned in the doorway, holding a crumpled note in his hand, the same one Miss Downey's boy had given him the day before. His ribs ached, his side was still bruised from the deputy's blow, but his eyes were sharper than ever. "I read it," he said quietly. "We need to move fast." The note was short, barely a sentence. "Check the base of the well at the old Smith Place rusted case beneath the stones." "Think it's bait?" Eliza asked, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Caleb gave a half nod. "Maybe, but I've seen Hollis cover his tracks. Wouldn't surprise me if he dumped more than just paperwork down that well." They saddled up before the rooster crowed a second time, riding hard toward the abandoned Smith homestead on the county line. The well sat quiet and forgotten, tucked behind a collapsed chicken coop and a tangle of dead vines. They brought a rope and a bucket. Caleb tied himself off and went down slow boots, scraping the stone lining. He reached the bottom mud-slick and cold and fumbled for the base. "Then I got it," he called up. Eliza braced her feet and pulled. When he emerged, he was soaked through a battered metal case in one hand. Back at her kitchen table, they pried it open with a fire poker. Inside lay a bundle of paper warped and yellowed, but still legible land deeds, tax logs, and one slim ledger with the Dusty Creek registry seal pressed firm into the corner. "It's all here," Caleb murmured. "The real registry, the one that went missing." "Why bury it?" Eliza whispered. "Because if the truth don't burn, they bury it deep enough, no one goes digging." She swallowed. "We need to make this public." He nodded. "There's a land auction scheduled for Thursday. Hollis plans to sell your acreage, claiming it reverted back to the county. If we show up with this, we can stop him." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Caleb made copies crude but readable of the most damning pages. Eliza rode out to neighboring farms, dropping by on pretense, but leaving behind folded clippings tucked into pie tins and seed sacks. Word spread in murmurs, not roars. Dusty Creek wasn't a town of loud defiance, but it remembered debt and fairness in equal measure. The night before the auction, Eliza stood in her parlor, hands calloused and ink-stained, staring at her father's portrait on the mantel. "I hope this is enough, Pa." She turned to Caleb. He was fitting his coat, rolling the creases out like it mattered. He looked at her quiet and firm. "You've done more than enough. Time they see it." Then the brick came through the window. Glass shattered across the floor. Eliza ducked instinct sharper than thought. Caleb threw his body across hers as another thud hit the porch. When they rose, blood ran from a shallow cut above Eliza's brow. She wiped it with the back of her sleeve. On the porch sat a single folded paper nailed to the wall. Foreclosure notice, Carter parcel dated for the next morning. Caleb picked it up, crumpled it once, then tossed it to the fireplace. "You all right?" he asked, turning to her. She was pale but steady. "I'm done flinching," she said. He nodded once slowly. "No more running," he echoed, "not from cowards with badges." The rest of the night, they sat with the evidence stacked like firewood between them, documents, copies, the rusted case still dripping. And outside, Dusty Creek held its breath. Because when the sun rose next, truth was finally stepping into town, wearing a busted hat and a ledger full of roots no fire could kill. The town meeting wasn't held in the courthouse. Judge Hollis said it was too official. Instead, he arranged a makeshift gathering under the awning outside the general store, with benches dragged from the church and crates repurposed for a stage. It looked casual, neighborly even, but it was a trap in plain sight. Eliza arrived before the bell struck 10. Her hair was tied back, her brow still bandaged from the broken glass. She wore her father's ledger like a satchel. Each step she took sounded louder than it ought to on the dirt road. Folks had come, more than she expected. Shopkeepers, ranch hands, Even the blacksmith's widow cane in hand stood beneath the awning's edge. But so had the sheriff. And this time he wasn't smiling. "Miss Carter," Sheriff Merrick announced, stepping onto the platform with practiced flair. "You're hereby under arrest for attempted fraud, public disruption, and obstruction of county proceedings." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few men shifted uncomfortably. One woman lowered her parasol. No one stepped forward. Eliza stood her ground. "You have no legal grounds. I've filed a counterclaim. The land was never lawfully transferred. That's for a court to decide." Merrick cut in. "Not you, not your dusty old ledger." Then two deputies moved in quick and practiced. Before she could blink, her wrists were pulled behind her and bound in coarse rope. Her ledger fell to the ground, pages fluttering like wounded birds. "You think this is justice?" she said, her voice even though her cheeks burned. The sheriff didn't answer. He turned to the crowd instead. "This here's what happens when someone spreads lies, tries to stir chaos. We're a peaceful town. Don't let one voice turn us against each other." Then he turned almost theatrically. And as for her so-called witness, Caleb was already being shoved forward, his coat half-buttoned, face flushed. A bruise still darkened his ribs from before. "This man aided a known fraud," the sheriff declared, "harbored her, hid stolen records." Caleb didn't resist as the deputy grabbed his shoulder. He stood tall, eyes locked on Eliza. "You don't break the truth by stomping it," the sheriff scoffed. "You don't get to lecture lawmen, Cowboy." Then for good measure, the deputy cracked Caleb across the ribs with a swift elbow. The crowd recoiled. A few turned away, but no one spoke. Eliza gritted her teeth. She wanted to scream, to shove her way out of the ropes and grab her ledger and show every last soul the truth, but Caleb caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of his head. "Let 'em talk," he'd said once. "Truth don't need shouting to be heard." Still, the silence was thick as cotton. Then came a break in it. From the edge of the crowd, a small voice called, "Wait!" All heads turned. It was Miss Downey's boy again, barefoot dirt on his knees, holding a folded slip of paper. He ran straight to Caleb and pressed it into his hand. "Mama said this goes with the other one." Then he disappeared back into the crowd before the deputies could move. The sheriff snatched the note from Caleb's hand, scoffing at the childish scrawl. But Caleb had already read it, and what it said made his jaw set tighter than a gate latch. South ledger room, behind false wall, registry logbook, Dusty Creek seal intact. Proof. More than they'd ever hoped. Eliza caught his glance, saw the spark flicker behind his pain. They had a trail now, something real, and if they could hold fast, they just might get the chance to show it. As the sheriff dragged them toward the jailhouse, Caleb leaned close. "Can't stop the tide," he murmured, "not when it's got a name and a seal." Eliza looked out at the crowd, most of them avoiding her gaze, but one or two faces looked down at her fallen ledger with something that might have been shame. Maybe the truth was still whispering even here, and maybe it wasn't done speaking yet. The sun rose over Dusty Creek like a judge clearing his throat dry, slow and full of reckoning. Folks gathered early at the town square for the auction. Judge Hollis stood beneath a canvas awning beside a polished podium, papers stacked neat as fence posts. Behind him, a large board bore the names of available parcels. Eliza Carter's land bolded in red ink. The sheriff was there too, arms crossed, eyes sweeping the crowd like a hawk over rabbits. Deputies flanked the stage. The show was set. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Hollis began, voice smooth as molasses and twice as thick. "Today we affirm this town's future through rightful legal ownership of unclaimed or defaulted properties. It's not just about land, it's about order." Murmurs of agreement rose. No one cheered, but no one questioned either. Not yet. He tapped the podium. "First parcel up, formerly the Carter homestead, claimed abandoned, reverting to county inventory due to unpaid taxes and..." "Hold it right there." The voice was strained hoarse from strain, but clear. Heads turned. From between two wagons stepped Caleb Boone, limping, face still bruised, coat dusted with dirt. His hand clutched the rusted metal case, now cleaned and tied with twine. Every step he took echoed louder than Hollis's polished words. Behind him came Eliza, her chin high, ledger strapped across her chest like armor. The sheriff started forward, but a few townsfolk shifted, blocking his path without a word. Caleb stepped up onto the platform without invitation. The judge looked furious. "You got no place here," Hollis barked. "This is a lawful auction, not a sideshow." "I reckon truth ain't ever been a sideshow," Caleb replied, untying the case and setting it down with a thud that cut through the morning stillness. From inside, he lifted the broken seal, the recovered registry logbook, and a handful of documents blackened by age but legible still. This, he said, voice flat as the Dusty Creek land registry entries scrubbed from public record, pages you had burned. Here's the seal that went missing. Here's the book from the South Ledger room behind a false wall. Eliza stepped forward beside him, opening her ledger with practiced hands. And this, she said, voice firm, is my father's planting and tax record, year after year. We paid what was owed. We never abandoned it. You just erased it. The judge tried to laugh it off. This is nothing but fabricated nonsense. Scribbles and hearsay. Then explain this. A voice cut him off, one from the crowd. Miss Downey, clutching her son's hand, stepped forward. I saw him. Told me to burn files the week before the transfer. I didn't know what I was doing till later, but I remember those pages, the seal. Silence hit hard. Then a rancher stepped forward. Caleb helped me with a survey once. Never charged a dime. If he says that seal's real, I believe him. The blacksmith's widow limped to the front. I remember Eliza's father planting every spring. Watched that land grow food for half this town. Even the registrar, quiet and pale, lifted his voice. We filed a lien on land we had no right to sell. That much I know now. Hollis turned red. This is a circus, a conspiracy. But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. They were looking at the papers, at the bruises, at the quiet, steady woman who hadn't backed down. Eliza picked up the torn foreclosure notice burned at the edges and held it up. This was nailed to my door. Same day the sheriff dragged me through the street in chains. No one spoke. Then the deputy who'd cracked Caleb's ribs stepped forward and laid his badge at the judge's feet. The silence said more than shouting ever could. The truth had landed, and for the first time in Dusty Creek, no one dared brush it away. The moment the deputy's badge hit the dirt, everything in Dusty Creek changed. It didn't happen with shouting or fistfights. No guns were drawn, just silence thick enough to stretch across every false deed and bruised rib in town. Judge Hollis's lips parted, but no words came out. The seal Caleb recovered sat on the podium, catching morning light like it was daring him to speak a lie. The sheriff took a half step back. Then a slow clapping started, just one pair of hands at first. Miss Downey. Others joined in, not with joy, but with something heavier relief. Vindication. A reckoning long overdue. Enough, Hollis snapped, trying to recover his footing. This town needs order. These theatrics do nothing but tarnish the rule of law. Eliza stepped forward, holding the tattered foreclosure notice in one hand and her father's ledger in the other. You want to talk about law? Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. My father built a life on that land, paid taxes, planted seed. You buried his name so you could profit off the dust. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't have to. They were listening now, really listening. And someone else had been too. From the back of the crowd, a tall man in a gray duster pushed through. His badge was different worn leather federal seal. He said nothing as he approached the platform, but his presence shifted the air. Caleb recognized him instantly. Marshall Bentley. Weeks ago, Caleb had quietly sent a packet copies of the ledger affidavits from Silas Boone and others and a letter. He didn't know if it had reached the right hands. Now the answer stood in front of them, 6'3" and carrying the weight of federal law. Marshall Bentley reached the platform and pulled a folded telegram from his coat. I've been sent by the U.S. Land Office, he said plainly. These documents, he motioned to the logbook. The seal, the ledger, are now part of an official fraud inquiry involving Dusty Creek land records from 1878 to present. He turned to Judge Hollis. You'll come with me. The judge scoffed. On whose authority? Bentley didn't flinch. On the authority of the people you defrauded. On the signatures buried under burned files. On the taxes paid and erased. On every witness standing right here. He looked to the sheriff. You too, Merrick. The sheriff tried to protest, but when two townsmen, both veterans, stepped forward, he quieted. Even the deputies didn't move to stop it. One even helped unbuckle Eliza's wrists quietly, respectfully, as if trying to shed his shame. Judge Hollis and Sheriff Merrick were led away. Not dragged, not humiliated. Just walked down the same steps they'd once used to lord over folks like Eliza and Caleb. And nobody said goodbye. It was quieter than expected. But justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers steady and sure. After they were gone, folks lingered. Miss Downey brought Eliza a peach pie wrapped in a towel. The blacksmith's widow handed Caleb a new bandage roll. Someone else dropped off the piece of the shattered window from Eliza's home with the words, "Sorry," scratched into the wood. Caleb stood beside Eliza on the steps, watching the crowd disperse into the morning sun. "You think that's it?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Reckon there's still work to do." She glanced down at the ledger in her hands, then at the soil beneath her boots. "Maybe now," she said, "we can finally plant something that gets to stay rooted." Caleb looked out across the square, at the people who had stayed silent then chose to speak, at the seal now resting in sunlight again. And in that stillness, with the wind brushing through the cottonwoods, something shifted. Not loudly, but deeply. Drop A if you believe justice don't need noise, just truth, grit, and a porch light that stays on. The rains came early that year. Not the kind that flooded out roads or made folks curse muddy boots, but the soft, steady kind that fed the earth. The kind you could smell before it even hit the soil, clean, promising like the land itself was ready to begin again. Eliza stood at the edge of her field, bare hands tucked into the pockets of a borrowed canvas coat. Her father's ledger, worn and sun-faded, sat open on the porch rail behind her right, where she'd left it. Not for courtrooms now, or proof, just memory. "You sure you want to start with lavender?" Caleb asked, stepping off the porch, with a satchel of seeds. She nodded. "Daddy always said it'd take root easy, even after fire." Caleb knelt beside her, fingers pressing into the damp earth. Then, lavender it is. The soil was dark and generous. Rows were marked with chalk string and hope. Eliza worked slow, methodical, showing Daniel how to plant pole beans 2 knuckles deep. The boy had grown quieter since it all happened, not out of fear, but focus. He listened more, asked smarter questions, wrote down everything. "You reckon we'll get enough to sell by end of summer?" he asked, voice light, but curious. "Maybe not much," Eliza said, brushing soil from her cheek, "but we'll get something that's ours." It wasn't just lavender and beans. Folks brought what they could. Tomato starts in mason jars, corn seeds saved in coffee tins. One man gifted them a mule with a bad knee but a good heart. A widow left a quilt stitched with the shape of their land so you remember where you stand, she'd said. Caleb fixed the broken porch swing with hickory and twine, made it just wide enough for 2. The nails didn't match and the rope creaked some, but it held steady. They didn't talk much sitting there, just watched the sun drop behind the ridgeline and the fireflies rise like prayers. "Strange," Eliza murmured one night, "how fast the dust settles after it all breaks loose." Caleb didn't answer right away. He watched Daniel chase moths with a lantern, careful not to step on the new shoots. "Eliza," he said finally, "you ever think about leaving? After all that happened?" She exhaled slow. "I did, but then I remembered this land ain't just dirt. It's sweat and meals and stories. It's where my daddy taught me to tie a fence knot and where Mama sang while she shelled beans. If I left, they'd win, quiet-like." Caleb nodded. "Sometimes quiet wins too." They sat that way till the sky went full dark, and Daniel's laughter faded into sleep. There were still hard days. The marshal's investigation dragged on. Some folks in town avoided eye contact, still stuck between pride and shame, but others like Miss Downey came by weekly to teach Daniel his lessons. The blacksmith's widow taught Eliza to graft apple trees. Even the saloon keeper offered up his wagon one Sunday when their mule got winded. Justice hadn't fixed everything, but it had made room for something better to grow. Late in July, Caleb brought a cedar box to Eliza on the porch. "Found this at the trading post," he said, scratching his neck. "Figured it'd do better here than sitting on some shelf." Inside was a brass plate engraved with her father's name and an empty ledger book bound in roughhide. For the next chapter, he added, Eliza ran her hand over the cover heart, catching a little in her throat. Then she set it beside the old one, open to a blank page, and picked up her pen. No title. Not yet. Just space. Space for rows planted and seasons logged. For names and storms and quiet victories. For every sunrise she intended to witness from that porch swing beside a man who never needed to speak loud to be heard. Drop A if you believe land can heal, and so can people, when truth gets its roots back in the ground.